my first theology lesson. Rumpled and furious, my grandfather's friend stood up in a bookstore on the north side and lamented the lost Jews of Poland and declared that he felt sorry for God, who had so many problems with justice and had become disillusioned and sad since he wanted to reveal himself to us, but couldn't find anyone truly worthy. It was always the wrong time or place in our deranged and barbaric century, and so withdrew into his own radiance and left us a limited mind and body to contemplate the ghostly absence, ourselves alone in a divine wilderness. When I was growing up in Chicago, my grandfather used to take me to a bookstore, and his friends used to have discussions, talk about books, argue a lot politically. And my grandfather died when I was 8 years old, so I was very young when this happened. But on one occasion, one of my grandfather's friends stood up and started to rant. And this poem is a memory of this rant, basically. And what he didn't say it in the way I've written it. It's how I remembered it. And it went on longer than my poem. But in thinking about this experience and trying to recapture the experience, to shape it in some way, I found the sonnet form immensely useful in bringing it into, giving it some kind of a structure. I realized in thinking about the poem and writing the poem that the last thing that came to me was the title. But this argument, he was making a kind of argument, a kind of case about God. I mean, it's a sort of notion, it's a theological notion, but of course I never would have understood that at the time, that someone gets up and says he feels sorry for God. What does that mean? It took me 30, 40 years to think about what did that mean? He felt sorry for God because God had so many problems with justice. And he wanted to find someone truly worthy to reveal himself to, but he couldn't find anyone, so he didn't come down. Now, that's a weird, complicated theological notion, but it was basically, he was just so furious about the Jews of Poland having been destroyed that that's what I focused on. That the Jews of Poland are gone, that's what I heard. But later I began to think, he's making a case here. Now, the reason that I think a sonnet form can work like this is you realize at a certain point, well, a sonnet is a poem that makes a case. A sonnet is a poem that creates an argument. A sonnet is a poem that rhetorically drives through something. So here I have a tremendous kind of furious argument, and here I've got to try and tame it. I've got to enact it. I've got to find a way to formalize it so that someone else can experience what I experienced. And here the sonnet form helped me. It enabled me to write something about it. It's an odd sonnet because it's all one sentence long, so it goes pretty quickly. And then to slow it down, I broke it down into 3-line stanzas. So it's not a traditional sonnet in that way. It's 4 3-line stanzas and a 2-line stanza at the end. And then it rhymes in an odd way. It rhymes A, B, A, B, C, B, C, D, E, like that. It's a rhyme scheme called terza rima. It's a rhyme scheme that's like a staircase. You're always going forward by looking back, because the rhymes go forward into a new stanza, but they also look back to the last stanza. So I felt, since I was in my first theology lesson writing a one-sentence poem, I didn't want the reader to stop on every rhyme. I wanted the reader to pause at the ends of lines on the rhymes, but not get stuck. So I prefer rhyming things somewhat oddly, like friend and Poland, or side and God, or God and sad, or justice and us, us and place, worthy and century and body, radiance, absence, wilderness. Now, there are strict constructionists who won't consider that rhyming. But I like a more expansive notion of rhyming that creates an echo and a sound that you hear, but doesn't stop the poem, but lets you keep moving. It's a little off. It's close, and yet it's also a little off. That when I was in school, sonnets were taught to me, as all forms were, in a way that I think was the wrong way. Because we were taught that a sonnet is 14 lines long, which it is, and has a certain rhythm, usually iambic pentameter, but it follows the rhythm of the language that it's in. It rhymes in a certain way. The Petrarchan sonnet is 8 and 6, and the Shakespearean sonnet is 3, 4s, and 2. And when we memorized it, we got an A. And if we didn't memorize it, we did poorly, shall we say. But no one ever said to us, why, or asked the question, why would someone want to write a sonnet? I mean, why would it be important? What's the history of the sonnet? Why is it interesting to read it? And I think if you come away from school and you know what a sonnet is, but you never want to read one again, then your education has failed you. The sonnet itself is a form that began around 1235 in Sicily, and it was invented by a group of lawyers, and it was called sonetto. In Italian means little song, and it was a kind of little song. Notaries who surrounded the court, and for some reason, no one knows exactly why, this form, starting in the 13th century, has been the most durable form in the history of poetry. So, no one knows exactly why the contours of rhetorical argument, making a case, seem to work so well for the sonnet, but it seems to be the case. And from the beginning, sonnets were traditionally about love. And something about the obsessiveness of love with the need to make an argument, you fill in the blanks, needing to convince someone, making a complaint, seems to be very useful to us for the nature of poetry, to communicate. And later, the sonnet began to expand its subject matter. So, for example, Milton began to write sonnets about occasional and political subjects. Before that, sonnets had almost been entirely about love poems. So the sonnet became a political form as well as a form for love poems. But it was still immensely useful for a kind of argument. Making a case in the first 8 lines and then resolving it in the second 6 lines seems to make a difference with what in Italian is called a volta, or turn. The traditional Petrarchan sonnet begins by making a case in 8 lines, then it takes a radical turn that changes the argument, that somehow responds to what's come in the first 8 lines, and then it resolves. There's also a sort of counter history, most people don't talk about it, that the sonnet actually, there are sonnets that go to different lengths. There are sonnets that are not 14 lines long. So the question about them is what makes them sonnets. And I would have to say that the thing that seems to identify it as a sonnet is a structural principle. Some kind of argument is set up and resolved or refuted or avoided. I would say that there are 2 ways that forms die, or that form dies. First of all, if you're writing poetry and you decide you want to write a sonnet, or you want to write a pantoum, or you want to write a sestina, or you want to write a villanelle, and the form totally controls you. We've all heard poems where the rhymes seem just there to fill out the form. Then the form is inert for you. The form is dead in that way. It is not alive. The form is controlling you. The only way you can write a good formal poem is if you can control the form, so that the form becomes the way in which you can express what you need to say. The form is the vehicle of your thought and feeling. And if you can use the form as a vehicle in that way, then you can express yourself and you can write a good poem. Otherwise, the form will control you. So there are always, even while the forms are alive, there are people not using them well. There are a lot of bad sonnets. There are probably more bad sonnets than any other form, because everyone who wants to write a bad love poem or wants to write a love poem at all writes a sonnet, and it's often, not the best, not very useful. Just as an aside, I'll say that the history of form is filled with corpses. That is, if a form isn't useful, it just dies out. So my idea is that a form like the sonnet, which has been continuously used, exists in poetry not just because some people like me like to write them, and some teachers and students like to read them, and others don't. It's because it must be serving some kind of function for knowledge. Otherwise it would die out. They're just too hard, these forms. They're too hard to write. They take too much thinking. There must be a reason for them, otherwise they just collapse. But then there's the other problem historically, which is certain forms die out. Now, no one knows exactly why that is the case. Anyone who tells you they know the exact reason, I think is fibbing to you and making something easier than it is. No one really knows. But what I would say is that probably there are forms that are modes of thinking that seem very wedded to their time and very useful to their time. Say a poetic form that would be the equivalent of what we now have as the reality TV show, which now feels like we've had it forever. And I just can't wait for it to go away. But we seem to have it for a while. It feels eternal while you have it. In 20 years, people will be going, what was reality TV again? And then in 50 years, they'll be going, wasn't there something called a sitcom? I don't remember what that was. These are forms that seem particularly suited. They're useful. They're popular entertainment. They seem particularly suited to our moment. But when the moment changes, they're not going to be alive. There's nothing that's really carrying through them. There's nothing universal in the way they're thinking. So what I would say is, in poetic forms, the heroic couplet, for example, was extremely useful for the 18th century, which was very orderly, which found a way to put things, needed to sum things up in certain kind of ways. Now you could say that that form is just not suited to the world we live in now. And it just, poets now just don't seem to be able to put their primary thoughts to fit with the kind of world we live in to make the heroic couplet operate for them. But what you could say is that the ghost of the heroic couplet lives in two-line stanzas. So there are poets who write two-line stanzas who may not be thinking of the heroic couplet themselves, but behind that in the history is the rhythm and the meter and the way of arguing that the heroic couplet had. And that poetry takes its power partially from having that history. I began writing poetry in high school, the way almost everyone begins writing poetry. It was really emotional desperation. It's generous to call what I was writing poetry. I was writing things down because I felt a lot, and I didn't know what to do with my feelings, and I gravitated towards poetry, as a lot of people do. I just never recovered. I just never got over this error. But I wouldn't say that I was a poet. I was a person in some pain who didn't know what to do with his feelings, and I just tried to write. And I felt better when I did it. When I was a freshman in college at Grinnell College in Iowa, I began to read poetry in a more serious way. I had teachers who gave me things to read, and I read it, and I just was entranced by what I read, and I read it with a kind of fury. I felt kind of saved by it. And when I began, and then I began to read poems that made a tremendous difference to me. I felt almost as if I had written them. Later I discovered that the oldest word for poetry in Greek is poesis, which means making. A poet is a maker and a poem is a made thing. And when you try to make something, then you're participating in poetry. When you're just expressing yourself, you're not. And at first I was just expressing myself. Then I was trying to create something apart from you. I mean, the writing of poetry has always seemed generous to me because it's not a diary entry. It's not just writing down what you feel. It's trying to take what you feel and make something out of it, articulate something, create something that will live apart from you, so that someone else could have the experience of reading it and feel what you felt. It would be a kind of drama that they would dramatically experience something of what you had felt, and that was a way that people had passed something on. Now, quite aside from this, or growing out of this as another kind of experience, all writers have to do is write their work. That's all that's required of them. If you're a poet, your main job is to write poetry. If you're a fiction writer, your main job is to write fiction. But if all the poets only write poetry, we have a serious problem in our country, because poetry is not part of the fabric of the culture. Poetry needs people to speak on its behalf. It's not the obligation of any one poet to do that. If you just want to stay in your room and write your poems, that's fine. But it's a catastrophe for the culture of poetry if everyone does that. And some people have a calling to do something else. I have a calling to do something else with my vocation, which is talk about poetry and what it means and argue on its behalf. Because there's never been a culture or civilization without poetry, which means that there must be something that's crucial to human knowledge. Otherwise, it's just too hard. It would just die away. Just as there's never been a culture without music. There must be something important in music that we as a species need. And I would say the same about poetry. Poems take place in our lives. They're there for our experiences. They're there because we're human and we're trying to explain and understand what it means to be alive. They're not there so teachers can get you to memorize what the nature of a poetic form is. They're not there for medicinal purposes, to cure you of something. They're there to help you, and they're to help you think about your own experience. I had poems that I read when I was in my early 20s that didn't mean anything to me at all. I could see they were great by the way they were formed, but they just didn't mean anything to me. But now in my 50s, they're dear to me. Now if I had never read those poems, never thought about those poems, never had those poems, they couldn't have meant anything to me later. But I've experienced things over time, and I've changed over time. I mean, in some ways I'm still the boy I was, and in other ways I'm not. And things have happened to me. And those poems, I understood something about those poems. Now, one of the problems with poems is that, for reading them young, is that certain things you can really only know what they mean as you get older, because you don't really completely understand the poignancy of loss so deeply until you start to get older. Now, I responded to certain poems, I think, without knowing quite what they meant, but I knew they were speaking to me in some kind of way. These poems are meant not just to read them in classes, they're meant to help you think about what it means to love someone, and what it means to be dying, and what it means to have someone dying on you, and what it means to dislike someone, and what it means to be enraged, and so forth and so on. That is, poems are really there for human use. They're really there for people's emotional lives. And it's the particular nature of poetry, because it's so short and because it's so intense, that it seems to hit the higher registers. If you have a sort of operatic temperament, as I do, if every day is a kind of huge opera or Shakespearean drama, shall we say, then poetry really helps you because it speaks to the extremes of experience. Why can't Why can't you just say what you mean? Why do you have to say one thing and mean another, which is one of the ulterior pleasures of poetry? Well, there are a lot of reasons why you can't just say what you mean. Sometimes you don't know what that is. Yes, in the simplest human emotions, yes, you know what that means. But sometimes you have more complicated feelings and you don't know quite what they are. And sometimes you want to capture something that's more complicated. You don't just love your father. You love your father, but you also hate him. And you love him and you hate him at the same time. How's that? You can't just say to your father, I love you and I hate you. It doesn't mean very much to do that. But in a poem, you can capture that combination of feelings. Say you remember being a child and your father is waltzing you around the room and you feel terrified, but you felt terrified, but you also felt exhilarated. How do you say, I was terrified, but I was exhilarated? And this was one of the great experiences of my life, but I was also terrified. How can you say that? And also, how can you make someone else understand what that means? If you just tell them, it doesn't mean anything. So you're Theodore Rutke and you have this experience, and so you write My Papa's Waltz. And when you read My Papa's Waltz now, we understood what he felt. The whiskey on your breath could make a small boy dizzy, but I hung on like death. Such waltzing was not easy. You get it. You feel it. Now, if I just told you, when I was young, my father would get drunk and he'd take me around the room, I'd be telling you something, but you wouldn't experience what I told you. You wouldn't have it alone to think about. You wouldn't have the dramatic experience. So why can't you just say what you mean? Because that's just telling you something. That's like an editorial in the newspaper, which tells you all the time what to think. But a poem dramatizes an experience. If you want someone to have the experience of what you had, then you need a delivery system. And poetry is a kind of delivery system to get what I'm feeling, which is maybe not always so easy for me to understand what that is, which can be complicated and multiple and have all kinds of nuances, over to you so that you can feel that complex of feelings. I mean, we need editorials, but if everyone is always just telling us what to do, it's not that useful. I don't think poems, for example, are so good at telling you how to vote. Editorials are fine for that. But what kind of experience that you have that would make you want to vote one way or another, a poem is good for that. So a poem is good for sort of embodying a kind of experience that you've had in life. So yes, it's annoying that things are sometimes complicated. And it's annoying that you can't just say things out. It would be better if you could. I prefer it not to have mixed feelings myself. I would like to be delivered from ambivalence. But it just doesn't seem like that's going to be my lot in life. I think I'm going to have ambivalent feelings about a lot of things. And so for ambivalence, for complication, for depth of feeling, then I think you need poetry to help deliver that to you.